Today we're going to look into 5 most evil serial killer stories. Let's begin with the first one.
It was past midnight in Seoul when a man walked into the rain, jacket pulled up tight, in an area filled with fancy apartment buildings that sparkled like diamonds. He walked toward a house that looked perfect and expensive. Inside, everything was peaceful and warm. An older couple, rich and successful, had no idea what was coming as they prepared to sleep. They did not hear when their front door opened. Minutes later, their peaceful life ended in violence and death. And that is how South Korea's deadliest serial killer started a killing spree that would terrify the whole country for months. His name was Yoo Young-chul, and the terrible things he did over the next 10 months were so awful that even experienced police officers could not sleep well after learning what happened. Yoo was not always a killer. He was born as an unwanted child on April 18, 1970 in Gochang County, South Korea. His family had almost no money. His father abandoned them early. His mother clearly did not want to raise him, and his grandmother took care of him. They stayed in a broken old house where cold air came through cracks in the walls and meals were usually just plain rice. Yoo was quiet and acted differently than other children. Kids at school made fun of him, and his teachers said he was lazy. He rarely talked to anyone, but he noticed everything. He noticed how children from wealthy families received praise. He noticed how people with money never had to struggle. And he noticed how his own family was ignored. These feelings stayed inside him forever. He began stealing when he was very young. First food, then clothing, then cash. By 18, he already had a criminal history. Theft, breaking into homes and creating fake documents. He spent most of his 20s going between youth jail and adult prison. But being locked up did not make him afraid. Instead, it showed him how to lie better, how to trick people, and how to hide his anger. In 1993, he got married. His wife worked giving massages, and for some time he attempted to have a regular life. They had a baby boy, but this family life fell apart quickly. In 2000, Yoo was found guilty of attacking a teenage girl. He returned to prison for several years. When they finally released him, his wife had divorced him. His son refused to talk to him, and his normal life was completely destroyed. While in prison, he learned about another killer named Jong Do-yong, who killed wealthy families in their homes. This fascinated him deeply. The way Jong secretly entered rich people's houses and murdered them. He thought, I could do that too. I could be even better. So when he left prison in September 2003, he did not try to fix his life. Instead, he started hunting for victims. The first murders were violent and well-planned. September 24th, 2003, a rich married couple living in an expensive neighborhood. Yoo broke into their home carrying a hammer and beat them both to death. He made it appear like a robbery, but he barely took anything. The crime looked confusing to police, but not scary enough to create public fear. 2 weeks passed and it happened again. 3 victims, another expensive house, no broken locks. Victims beaten with their heads crushed, nothing important stolen. During the next 6 weeks, he murdered 6 more people using the exact same method. Rich people, older couples, beaten to death, usually while they slept in their own beds. Police investigators had no clues. The crimes did not match normal robbery patterns, but they also did not seem like serial killer behavior. And Yoo was extremely careful with every detail. He always wore gloves. He changed into different clothes after each crime. He escaped through back doors or climbed out windows. and he watched television news every night to check if police suspected him. They did not. But then something changed. In December, Yu began dating a new girlfriend. She was young, attractive, and worked at a massage business. For a short moment, Yu thought maybe he could start over. But when she learned about his criminal background and that he had no money, she ended their relationship immediately. That rejection hurt him deeply, and it changed something inside his mind. Yu decided to stop killing rich people. Now he planned to murder women instead, specifically sex workers. He claimed it was to clean up society and punish them for being immoral. But that was false. The truth was simple. He hated these women because one of them had rejected him. He rented a very small apartment in Western Seoul and transformed it into a killing place. He would telephone massage companies, request a private appointment, and wait for the woman to arrive. When she entered through the doorway, Yu acted completely charming, always smiling and being polite. He would give her something to drink and make friendly conversation. Then when she turned her back, he would suddenly hit her hard in the head using a hammer. He murdered them very quickly. Then he cut their bodies into pieces in his bathroom using sharp saws and knives. He kept the water running to hide any sounds. He wrapped the body parts into plastic bags. Sometimes he cooked the human flesh to prevent bad smells. Other times he threw the remains in distant mountain areas or empty construction locations. Between March and July 2004, Yu killed at least 11 women using this horrible method, possibly even more. The killings became more frequent. In July, he killed 2 different women in less than 7 days. He seemed unstoppable, but he was also starting to make careless mistakes. Multiple massage businesses began noticing that their employees were vanishing after going to appointments in the same location. A few women who survived even described a strange man who made them feel uncomfortable. He was too silent, too cold. On July 15, 2004, one business owner created a trap. He sent 2 employees to Yu's apartment with a secret plan to contact police if anything dangerous happened. The moment one woman walked into the building and felt something was wrong, she escaped. Police officers arrived minutes later and discovered Yu standing calmly in the hallway, looking surprised but not panicked. At the police station, he refused to speak for many hours. Then suddenly, he asked for a cigarette. When the officer gave him one, Yu said something shocking. "I have killed 20 people." Officers thought he was lying until he explained exactly where all the bodies were hidden. He took investigators to mountains, to rivers, to public parks where human bones were buried inside garbage bags and shallow graves. He explained every single murder with complete details. Names, specific dates, and what tools he used. At his trial in court, Yu smiled inappropriately. When victims' family members cried and screamed, he just stared with blank, empty eyes. One time, when an angry man tried to attack him in the courtroom, Yu actually laughed out loud. He confessed to everything without holding back. He stated he had no guilt or regrets. When the judge asked him why he committed these murders, he simply answered, "Because I hated those people." He received a death sentence in June 2005. But in South Korea, the government has not executed anyone since 1997. So Yu remains locked in solitary confinement today, with his execution delayed forever. He spends every day alone in a tiny prison cell being monitored constantly. His terrible story became huge in the media. News programs repeated his confession videos constantly. Documentary films analyzed his criminal mind. A famous movie called The Chaser was loosely inspired by his crimes. Even years afterward, his name still creates fear in the nation's memory. But the most frightening part is that he never appeared to be a dangerous monster. Not until it was too late. There exist photographs of Yu from the early 2000s, dressed in a normal jacket, looking like any regular man you might see on public transportation. Nobody suspected the quiet neighbor was inviting innocent people to their deaths, with nothing except a friendly smile and convincing lies. He did not follow his victims through dark streets. He welcomed them inside politely, and they never walked back out alive. In total, he admitted to murdering 26 people. Police could only confirm 20 deaths, but some investigators believe the actual number is much higher. Today, Yu Young-chul stays as one of the most frightening criminals in South Korea's entire history. Not just because of what he did, but because of how easily he did it, how calmly he confessed everything, and how carefully he planned his violence. It is not the blood or the total number of victims that haunts people's minds most. It is the terrifying thought that someone exactly like him could be standing right behind you while waiting in line, appearing friendly and silent, making plans to kill, and you would never realize anything until it is far too late to escape. While Yu Young-chul terrified South Korea in the early 2000s,
Let's move on to the second serial killer.
something terrible was about to happen in the spring of 1982. In a quiet park in Anchorage, Alaska, 4 young friends were setting up camp for what should have been a perfect evening. They had snacks, music, and plans to catch a movie later. The air was warm enough that they had traded their heavy winter coats for light hoodies. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed safe. But someone was already watching them. Someone who had made a decision that would change everything forever. Someone who had already killed before and walked free. Someone the system had failed to stop. What happened next would shock the entire city and force Alaska to change its laws forever. This is a story about 2 different men in 2 different places whose crimes were so brutal that still make people shiver today. But before we get to that night in Alaska, we need to understand how these men slipped through the cracks of justice, how they were free to hunt when they should have been locked away, and how the warning signs were there all along, but nobody was paying attention. The first man nobody really noticed. Maybe that's exactly why he got away with it for so long. His name was Charles, and he grew up in a house where silence was heavy and frightening. His mother suffered from a mental illness that cast shadows over their family home in Michigan. Stories about his childhood were few, but those who remembered him described a boy who never quite connected with the world around him. At 16, he left home and never returned. He drifted across the country, picking up small arrests along the way. Shoplifting here, trespassing there. His criminal record was short but strange. By the early 1970s, he had made his way to Alaska, just another face in a state full of people running from something. Then, in 1973, something inside him broke completely. He met a young man named Robert, a 22-year-old grocery store worker. There was no fight between them, no argument, no reason at all. Charles would later tell police that he simply didn't like the way the young man talked, so he beat Robert to death in a park with a piece of metal he found on the ground. He didn't run. He didn't lie. He turned himself in and told the police everything. But instead of going to prison, Charles was declared not guilty by reason of mental illness. Doctors said he had paranoid mental problems and sent him to a high-security hospital in California for people who had committed crimes while mentally ill. For 7 years, he stayed in that hospital. Then in 1980, doctors made a decision that would cost 4 young people their lives. They said Charles was better. They said he was no longer hearing voices. They said he wasn't violent anymore. He seemed calm, medicated, and cooperative. So they let him go. Charles was transferred back to Alaska for supervised re-entry into society. That's how the system works when someone is considered no longer dangerous. They try to slowly reintroduce them with oversight. But the oversight didn't last long enough. Charles started working regular jobs. He washed dishes, worked in clothing stores, kept books for small businesses. He even enrolled in college classes. He was quiet. He showed up on time. He didn't cause trouble. And because of strict privacy laws, none of his bosses, co-workers, or classmates ever knew that the man working beside them had beaten someone to death just a few years earlier. But Charles started drinking again. That should have been a huge warning sign. One of the most important conditions of his release was that he stay sober. But nobody noticed. Or if they did, they didn't say anything. And slowly, the thin barrier between Charles and his violent impulses began to dissolve. Then came May 3rd, 1982. Charles later told investigators that someone had stolen his favorite shirt. Nobody knows if this was even true, or just something his troubled mind created. But he became obsessed with it. He wanted revenge. Or as he put it, I wanted to steal something back. That day he bought a blue bicycle and a gun from a local shop. He wrapped the weapon in cloth, rode the bike into the woods near Russian Jack Springs Park, and buried the gun under a patch of melting snow. He was preparing for something terrible. That evening, as darkness began to fall, Charles returned to the park. That's where he found them. 4 teenagers were camping near a trail. Joseph, 19, was the first to spot him. Charles had crept up near their tent, probably looking for something to steal. When Joseph caught him, Charles pulled out the gun and shot the young man in the back of the head. The second boy, Vern, 18, ran toward the sound of the gunshot. Charles shot him in the face. Then came the 2 girls. 17-year-old Rebecca and 16-year-old Sabrina came to see what was happening. One by one, he turned the gun on them. 4 shots. 4 young lives ended. Charles didn't take anything. He didn't speak to them. He just picked up his empty bullet casings, buried the gun again, and rode off into the darkness on his blue bicycle. 3 days later, hikers found the bodies. They were still in the clearing, partially sunk into the thawing ground. Police arrived to find almost no clues. No wallets were missing. No valuables were taken. There were no signs of a struggle. It seemed like a perfect crime. But then, investigators found something. A blue bicycle abandoned nearby. It was a rare model sold at only one shop in town. Police pulled the sales records and found just one recent purchase under that model. Charles Meach. When they brought him in for questioning, he confessed immediately. Calmly. Coldly. He told them where he had hidden the gun, where he bought the bike, how he approached the teenagers, how each one died. When asked why, he gave no real reason other than, I had a few drinks and I did all the things I wasn't supposed to do. Charles tried once again to use the mental illness defense, but Alaska had changed its laws just weeks before the murders. Now the burden was on the defense to prove that someone couldn't tell right from wrong. Charles had hidden the weapon. He had buried the evidence. He confessed in perfect detail. The jury didn't believe he was mentally ill during the crime. He was found guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 396 years in prison. At the time, it was the longest sentence ever given in Alaska. The public was outraged when they learned the truth. Charles had been quietly released back into society after killing someone in 1973. Employers were furious. Parents were terrified. Everyone wanted to know how a man who had already murdered someone could be walking around town with no supervision, able to buy a weapon and choose his next victims. Charles died in prison in December 2004. Natural causes. There was no obituary, no family statement, no memorial service. But the story doesn't end there. Hundreds of miles away, in the wooded landscape of East Texas, another man was about to prove that the system's failures weren't limited to Alaska.
Let's move on to the third serial killer.
His name was Jerry, and he was born in 1948 in rural Texas. Unlike Charles, Jerry's childhood didn't include the typical background that people expect from violent criminals. No reported abuse, no severe trauma. But teachers and neighbors remembered him as quiet, tense, and strangely cold. He didn't act out in obvious ways. He didn't pick fights with other children. But when he looked at you, people said it felt like he was trying to figure out how much pain you could handle. By his late teens, Jerry had dropped out of high school and was drifting across Texas doing manual labor, mechanic work, welding, construction, always short-term jobs. People who worked with him would later say the same thing over and over. He gave off a weird energy. Not angry, not threatening, just wrong. In 1972, he was convicted of a brutal attack on a woman. He served 5 years in prison and was released. A year later, he was arrested again for another violent assault. In 1978, it happened again. This time, he was finally given a longer sentence. But despite the clear pattern of violence and the obvious risk he posed, the Texas Parole Board made a decision in 1985 that would cost 3 young people their lives. They released Jerry early. No ankle monitor, no restrictions, just out. He moved to Hawkins, a small wooded town in East Texas where nobody knew his name, nobody knew his record. He worked odd jobs and drove a distinctive two-tone blue and white truck. On May 4th, 1986, 3 young people drove out to Lake Hawkins for a quiet afternoon by the water. Suzanne was 18 and had just been accepted to college. Gina was 20 and studying psychology. Brian was 19 and known around town for always helping anyone who had car trouble. They were the kind of people who made others smile just by being around. They parked near the trees, turned up the radio, and walked toward the lake. They weren't doing anything dangerous. They weren't involved in any kind of trouble. They were just young and free, enjoying a beautiful spring day. What happened next was pieced together by detectives later through evidence and witness statements. At some point during the afternoon, Jerry approached them, likely with a weapon. He forced them into their car and drove them away from the lake. Witnesses later remembered seeing his distinctive truck parked near the area, watching. The next morning, Suzanne's body was found on Barnwell Mountain. She had been brutally assaulted and strangled. The way her body was positioned indicated that she had been posed after death, showing a level of cruelty that shocked even experienced investigators. 2 days later, the bodies of Gina and Brian were discovered in a ditch off a rural road. Both had been shot in the head at close range. Police quickly began connecting the dots. Witnesses described a man matching Jerry's appearance near the lake. His truck had been seen in the area. When they brought him in for questioning, they found he still had the murder weapon, a revolver. Tests proved it was the same gun used to kill Gina and Brian. Fibers from Suzanne's clothing were found in his vehicle. It was enough evidence to charge him with capital murder. The town thought it was over. They thought they were finally safe. They were wrong. On July 9th, 1986, Jerry did something that sent the entire region into panic. He escaped from jail. He managed to overpower a guard, steal a weapon, and kidnap a 24-year-old female jail employee named Rosalie. He handcuffed her to himself and fled in a stolen car. They disappeared into the thick East Texas woods. For 16 terrifying hours, Rosalie was his prisoner. She would later say that Jerry acted completely calm the entire time, smiling, talking like everything was normal. At one point, he told her something that made her blood run cold. "I've already killed 3 people. One more won't matter." Rosalie finally managed to escape when Jerry fell asleep, and she was able to slip out of the handcuffs. The manhunt that followed was massive. Over 1,000 officers from multiple agencies, helicopters, search dogs, roadblocks everywhere. Local residents were told to lock their doors and stay inside. After 2 days of searching, Jerry was found hiding in an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. Surprisingly, he surrendered without a fight. In 1987, Jerry went on trial for Suzanne's murder. The courtroom was packed with angry, grieving community members. Prosecutors presented evidence from all 3 killings, plus his past convictions and his dramatic escape from jail. The jury took less than an hour to sentence him to death. Jerry was sent to Texas's death row, where he spent 12 years in solitary confinement, filing appeal after appeal. He never gave interviews to reporters. He never expressed any remorse for what he had done. He didn't deny his crimes. He just didn't seem to care. On October 14, 1999, Jerry was executed by lethal injection. But even that wasn't the end of the story. In 2019, 20 years after Jerry's execution, cold case detectives in Portland, Oregon, reopened an old case from 1979. A 20-year-old woman named Anna had been found in her apartment, brutally assaulted and strangled. There had never been any suspects. The case had gone completely cold. But DNA evidence from the crime scene had been preserved. Investigators ran it through new forensic technology that compares crime scene DNA to public ancestry databases. The match was clear and shocking. Jerry Walter McFadden. He had been there, in Oregon, in 1979, 7 years before the Lake Hawkins murders. 7 years before anyone in Texas even knew his name. Authorities now believe there may be many more victims. Women attacked in different states, different years. Jerry moved around constantly in the 1970s and 1980s. There were gaps in his record, times when he simply disappeared for months at a time. In an age before digital records and instant communication, someone like Jerry could vanish with a fake name, a stolen license plate, and a quiet back road. And he knew how to wait. He knew how to watch. He knew how to pick the exact moment when nobody was looking, then strike quickly and fade back into the shadows. Even law enforcement has admitted they may never know the full scope of Jerry's crimes across multiple states and decades. After his final arrest, one of the investigators who worked the case described Jerry in a single word that still haunts those who heard it. Empty. "You looked in his eyes," the investigator said, "and there was just nothing there." Today, Russian Jack Springs Park in Alaska is still open to the public. People walk those trails, camp in those clearings, and enjoy the natural beauty. There's no marker where the 4 teenagers died. Most people who visit have no idea what happened there. Lake Hawkins in East Texas is also still a popular spot for young people. Families still come to swim and fish. The lake is beautiful and peaceful, but some locals remember and they watch their children a little more carefully. These cases changed laws in both Alaska and Texas. Alaska tightened its rules for releasing people who had been found not guilty by reason of mental illness. Texas reformed its parole system to prevent early release of violent criminals. But the changes came too late for 7 young people who simply wanted to enjoy life. 4 friends in Alaska just wanted to camp under the stars and catch a movie later. 3 friends in Texas just wanted to spend a sunny afternoon by the lake. They were students, workers, dreamers. They helped their neighbors, made their families proud, and had bright futures ahead of them. Joseph, Vern, Rebecca, and Sabrina in Alaska. Suzanne, Gina, and Brian in Texas. They deserve to grow up, fall in love, start careers, have families of their own. Instead, they became victims of a system that failed to protect them from men who should never have been free to hunt again. The most chilling part of both stories isn't the violence itself. It's how easily it could have been prevented. Charles had already killed someone. Jerry had already attacked multiple women. The warning signs were there. The danger was clear. But bureaucracy, legal technicalities, and a system more concerned with rehabilitation than public safety allowed 2 predators to walk free and choose their next victims. 7 families lost children they'll never get back. 7 futures were erased in moments of senseless violence. 7 lights were snuffed out by men whose eyes showed nothing but emptiness where human compassion should have been. And somewhere out there may be other cases that went cold because nobody connected the dots in time. That's the truly terrifying part of these stories. Not just what these men did, but what they might have done that we'll never know about. The investigators were right about Jerry. When you looked in his eyes, there really was nothing there. And Charles, described by those who knew him as someone who never quite connected with the world around him, proved that some people are simply too dangerous to ever be given a second chance. These cases remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it walks quietly among us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sometimes it looks ordinary, even harmless. Sometimes the greatest monsters are the ones nobody notices until it's too late. Do you want to learn more about criminal behavior and how to stay safe in our society? These tragic stories show us how important it is to recognize warning signs and understand how dangerous people think and act. Share this story and follow our channel so more people can stay aware and protect themselves and their families from harm.
Let's move on to the 4th serial killer.
The smell started in summer. At first, nobody paid attention. In North Philadelphia, bad smells were normal. Dead cats, old garbage, broken pipes. These things happened all the time. But this smell was different. It was thick, heavy, and getting worse every day. The smell came from the 3rd floor of 1811 North 19th Street, a crumbling apartment building where screams were more common than sleep, where every stair creaked under the weight of broken dreams. The building was home to forgotten people, drug addicts, sex workers, and others that society had given up on. On the 3rd floor lived a thin, quiet man everyone called Marty. He walked with a limp and was rarely seen without his bright blue Cookie Monster puppet. Most people thought he was harmless, just another lost soul in a city full of them. Odd, yes, but harmless. Until the summer heat made the walls sweat something terrible. Until complaints flooded in. Until the landlord finally broke down that door. What they found inside would change everything. What they discovered would make this one of Philadelphia's most shocking crimes ever. The building at 1811, North 19th Street, was falling apart, just like everything else in North Philadelphia. Paint peeled from the walls like old skin. Stairs groaned with every step. The hallways smelled like mold, sweat, and despair. It was the kind of place people went to disappear from the world. This was 1987, and crack cocaine had turned North Philadelphia into a war zone. Violence was everywhere. People vanished all the time. Nobody asked too many questions. In this neighborhood, minding your own business wasn't just smart, it was survival. Among all these forgotten souls lived a man who seemed different from the rest. His real name was Harrison Frank Graham, but everyone called him Marty. He was thin, soft-spoken, and walked with a noticeable limp. He always carried a bright blue Cookie Monster puppet everywhere he went. The puppet had wide, innocent eyes and a cheerful smile that seemed out of place in such a dark neighborhood. Marty was polite when neighbors passed him in the hallway. He sometimes asked to borrow cigarettes. His voice was gentle, almost like a child's. He seemed harmless, maybe even a little sad. People felt sorry for him more than afraid of him. What they didn't know was that behind his innocent appearance and childlike behavior, something terrible was growing. Harrison Frank Graham was born on September 9th, 1959, right there in North Philadelphia. He grew up just a few miles from where he would later commit his crimes. He was the oldest of 5 children, but also the quietest and most troubled. His teachers said he was slow to learn. Tests showed his IQ was only 63, just above the level doctors call intellectual disability. While other kids played games and made friends, Harrison preferred watching cartoons and listening to disco music. He loved that blue puppet more than anything else in the world. He took it everywhere, talked through it when he couldn't find his own words. He named it Mr. Cookie. The puppet became his best friend, his confidant, his voice when he had no voice. Some neighborhood kids made fun of him for carrying a puppet around, but most people just ignored him completely. When Harrison was a teenager, he quietly dropped out of school. There were no graduation photos, no goodbye parties, no plans for the future. He just faded into the background of North Philadelphia's forgotten people. Nobody seemed to notice. Nobody seemed to care. With no education, no job skills, and no real family support, Harrison disappeared into a world of late-night television, cheap snacks, and long conversations with his worn blue puppet. He talked to the puppet more than he talked to real people. The puppet seemed to understand him better than humans ever could. At first, Harrison used pills to calm the constant buzzing in his head. Then came heroin, which gave him peaceful, sleepy hours away from the harsh reality of his life. But when crack cocaine exploded through North Philadelphia in the early 1980s, it hit Harrison like a freight train. Everything that was left of his already fragile mind began to fall apart. He used his monthly disability checks to buy drugs. Sometimes he traded his food money for just one more hit. He would disappear for days at a time, lost in a haze of smoke and broken thoughts. His family stopped checking on him. His few friends drifted away. He became completely isolated from the world. Somewhere in that cloud of drugs and madness, something inside Harrison's mind snapped. He crossed a line that decent people never cross. Harrison eventually rented a small apartment on the 3rd floor of 1811 North 19th Street. The building was perfect for people who wanted to disappear. It barely had working utilities. The landlord didn't ask many questions as long as the rent got paid. Most tenants were drug addicts, prostitutes, or others living on society's edges. Harrison turned his apartment into something strange and disturbing. He never cleaned anything. He let garbage pile up like walls around his home. He nailed the windows shut so nobody could see inside. He lived like a hermit, only coming out when he needed cigarettes or drugs. Inside that sealed apartment, time seemed to stop moving. The women who would later become Harrison's victims were society's most forgotten people, just like him. Most were prostitutes struggling with drug addiction. Others were homeless women looking for a safe place to sleep. They were people that the world had already given up on. People who could disappear without anyone asking too many questions. Harrison didn't hunt these women down like some killers do. He didn't drag them off the street or trick them into his apartment. They came willingly. He offered them a safe place to crash for the night. He offered free drugs or a hot meal. His voice was always soft and gentle, almost childlike. Sometimes he introduced them to his puppet. Sometimes he let the puppet do the talking. But something terrible happened when the drugs wore off and reality came back. Something inside Harrison's broken mind would snap. The women would become real to him again instead of just objects. They would make noise, ask questions, want to leave. And Mr. Cookie, according to Harrison, didn't like that. What happened next in that sealed apartment was unspeakable. But the women never left. One by one, over the course of about a year, they entered Harrison's apartment and never came out again. Some neighbors heard arguments through the thin walls. Others heard loud music playing at strange hours. One person reported hearing someone talking late at night, but nobody could tell who was answering back. The first signs that something was wrong came in the spring of 1987. A young woman named Robin had been Harrison's girlfriend for a few months. She was a prostitute and drug addict, but she had family who cared about her. When she suddenly stopped calling her mother, people started asking questions, but Robin had vanished into Harrison's apartment, and nobody knew to look there. More women began disappearing around the same time. Barbara, only 22 years old, had been working the streets to support her drug habit. Sandra, a mother of two, had been missing for weeks before anyone filed a police report. Cynthia had been gone for over 6 months. These women lived dangerous lives, so people assumed they had just moved on or met with the usual street violence. But they hadn't moved on. They were all inside Harrison's apartment, and Harrison was living with them in ways that no sane person could imagine. He didn't panic after what he did to them. He didn't try to move them or hide them. He simply stepped over them and continued living his life. He slept near them. He ate meals near them. He played loud music to cover the sound of flies. As the weeks and months passed, Harrison's apartment became something from a nightmare. The smell grew stronger and stronger. He lit candles and sprayed cheap air freshener, but nothing could hide the stench of death. He piled garbage higher and higher, maybe trying to bury the evidence, or maybe just because he had completely lost touch with reality. Neighbors began complaining about the smell in the spring of 1987. At first, they blamed the usual suspects: dead animals, rotting garbage, broken sewer pipes. The landlord ignored most complaints because tenants were always complaining about something. But as summer arrived and the heat grew intense, the smell became impossible to ignore. People in the building started getting sick. They couldn't eat. They couldn't sleep. The stench would hit them in waves, especially when the wind blew a certain way. Some tenants threatened to move out if something wasn't done. Others called the city health department. The pressure on the landlord grew stronger every day. Meanwhile, Harrison kept living his normal routine as if nothing was wrong. Neighbors saw him coming and going from the building. He still asked to borrow cigarettes. He still spoke in that soft, childlike voice. He still carried his blue puppet everywhere. One neighbor later told police they heard him having conversations through the apartment wall late at night. They assumed he was talking to a girlfriend or roommate. They never guessed he was talking to the dead. But even Harrison couldn't hide what was happening inside that sealed room forever. The summer heat of 1987 made the smell unbearable. Complaints flooded the landlord's office daily. Harrison stopped answering his door when people knocked. He missed his rent payments for the first time. The landlord decided enough was enough. In August 1987, armed with an eviction notice and accompanied by a police officer, the landlord went to Harrison's apartment. They knocked loudly and demanded he open the door. When nobody answered, they could hear strange rustling sounds from deep inside. The landlord used his master key to unlock the door, but it wouldn't open. Something was blocking it from the inside. They had to push hard, shoving aside piles of garbage that had been stacked against the entrance. As the door finally swung open, the smell hit them like a physical force. Both men immediately started gagging and had to step back. What they saw inside that apartment was beyond their worst nightmares. Garbage was piled waist-high throughout the entire space. Old food containers, empty beer bottles, used drug needles, broken furniture, and children's toys were scattered everywhere like the remains of some terrible storm. The air was thick and still, heavy with the stench of decay. But it wasn't the garbage that made even experienced police officers sick to their stomachs. Hidden under mattresses, stuffed into closets, and buried beneath piles of trash were 7 human bodies. 7 women who had entered this apartment alive and never left. Some of the bodies were so badly decomposed, they were barely recognizable as human. The summer heat, combined with the sealed windows and lack of air circulation, had turned the apartment into an oven. Flesh had melted and fused to the floor. Bones had separated from decaying tissue. The scene was like something from the worst horror movie ever made. And there, sitting among all the death and decay, was the Cookie Monster puppet. Its bright blue fabric was stained with blood and other things too horrible to describe. Its wide, innocent eyes seemed to be watching everything. Its cheerful cartoon smile made the scene feel even more grotesque and unreal. But when police and the landlord came looking for answers, Harrison was nowhere to be found. He had somehow known they were coming. Maybe he had been watching from his window. Maybe he had finally realized he couldn't hide the truth any longer. Whatever the reason, he had climbed out his window and down the fire escape, disappearing into the streets of Philadelphia like a ghost. The police immediately launched a massive manhunt. They searched every crack house, every abandoned building, every place Harrison might hide. They questioned his family members, his few remaining friends, anyone who might know where he had gone. But Harrison had vanished without a trace. For 3 days, one of Philadelphia's most wanted men walked free, while the city learned about the horrors inside his apartment. News reporters swarmed the building. Curious crowds gathered outside. Police officers worked around the clock to remove the bodies and process the crime scene. The smell was so bad that investigators had to wear special masks and take frequent breaks. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, something unexpected happened. Harrison Frank Graham walked into a Philadelphia police station and calmly turned himself in. He told the desk officer that there were bodies in his apartment and that he needed help. He said he didn't understand why he had done what he did. During his confession, Harrison spoke in the same soft, childlike voice that neighbors remembered. He showed almost no emotion. He explained that the women had upset Mr. Cookie by being too loud or difficult. He said they wouldn't leave when he asked them to. He described the killings as if they had been someone else's actions, as if he had been watching from outside his own body. Harrison handed over his apartment keys and then gave the police his Cookie Monster puppet, as if that small blue toy could somehow explain the horror he had created. He sat quietly while detectives asked him questions, answering in simple words and short sentences. He couldn't explain why he had done it. He just knew that he had. The investigation revealed the full scope of Harrison's crimes. 7 women had died in the department over the course of about a year. During the cleanup process, a sanitation worker discovered a green duffel bag that had been left on the building's rooftop. Inside were dismembered body parts, legs, feet, and portions of a torso that had been carefully cut apart. When police returned to search the building's basement, they found additional remains: a partial skull, pelvic bones, and ribs. This woman, whose identity remains unknown even today, had been chopped into pieces and scattered throughout the building. Nobody knows how long her remains had been there. Maybe months, maybe even longer. All this time, while 7 women rotted inside his apartment, Harrison had been living among them as if nothing was wrong. He slept in the same room with corpses. He ate meals surrounded by death. He carried on conversations with his puppet while bodies decomposed just a few feet away. It was a level of madness that most people couldn't even imagine. Harrison's defense team immediately pushed for an insanity plea. He had an IQ of only 63, barely above the level of intellectual disability. Multiple psychiatrists diagnosed him with severe mental impairments. He couldn't even spell his own name correctly on legal documents. He seemed more like a confused child than a calculated killer. But when the case went to trial in 1988, the jury wasn't convinced. They had seen the crime scene photographs. They had heard testimony about the evidence of planning and concealment. They knew about the 7 women who had died horrible deaths. The pictures of rotting corpses and the testimony about months of living with the dead was too much for them to overlook. The courtroom was packed when the verdict was announced. Harrison Frank Graham was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death 6 times, plus 1 life sentence. The room fell completely silent when the judge read the sentences. No gasps, no crying, just heavy, suffocating quiet like everyone had forgotten how to breathe. Harrison didn't react at all to the verdict. He sat perfectly still in his orange prison jumpsuit, eyes half closed, the same blank expression he had worn throughout the entire trial. It was as if none of it had anything to do with him, as if someone else had committed these crimes and he was just an innocent bystander. For the next 15 years, Harrison's case was buried in legal appeals and court challenges. Psychiatrists, public defenders, and judges argued about what it really means to be legally insane. They debated whether his childlike behavior was genuine or an elaborate act. They questioned whether a man with the mental capacity of a young child could truly understand death or deserve to die for his crimes. Then, in 2002, the United States Supreme Court made a landmark decision that changed everything. In Atkins versus Virginia, the court declared that executing mentally disabled individuals was unconstitutional, regardless of their crimes. If someone couldn't understand what death meant or why it was happening to them, the state wasn't allowed to execute them. Today, Harrison Frank Graham remains locked away in SCI Phoenix, a maximum security prison in Pennsylvania. He is now in his mid-60s and spends his days in a psychiatric unit under constant observation. Guards describe him as quiet, strange, and completely disconnected from reality. He rarely speaks to anyone. This tragic story teaches us to stay aware of the people around us. Share this story to help others stay aware of such dangerous people and crimes. Subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories that could save your life.
Let's move on to the fifth serial killer.
French-born serial killer Patrick Shaw had already horrified authorities 10 years earlier with his disgusting House of Horrors murders. It was the type of building most people would walk past without noticing. Collapsed roof, shattered windows, wild plants growing up the walls. Inside, the air felt thick with mold, dust, and something unexplainable that seemed to stick to your skin. And hidden underneath all that decay was a scene so disgusting that even experienced officers felt sick. On one wall, written in crude black paint, "Death Room." Below those words lay what used to be a living woman, now brutally murdered and destroyed. Her body was positioned like twisted artwork. Investigators didn't realize it yet, but they had just discovered the sick mind of Patrick Shaw, a man with no home, no verifiable past, and no trace of human conscience. Patrick Joseph Max Shaw was born into complete silence in 1966. Abandoned at a French orphanage days after birth with no explanation. From the beginning, something about him was different. He didn't play with other kids. He simply watched. While other children created friendships, he created habits. Lying, stealing, manipulating. He would cry when he wanted something, laugh when others felt pain, and show no expression when punished. By 16, he was gone from the system. He bounced between odd jobs, homeless shelters, and train stations. Patrick was like a ghost. In the early 1990s, he drifted into Italy, surviving on charity and manipulation. He possessed a weathered charm, with eyes that seemed to look straight through a person. People gave him food, offered rides, gave their trust. They always regretted it. By 1995, he was homeless along the Ligurian coast. That's where he met Ingrid Neuber, a German woman also struggling. She was soft-spoken, shy, completely worn down. They traveled together, sleeping in alleyways and abandoned houses. Patrick made her feel protected. That was his gift. They found an old crumbling house in Cuneo, tucked away off a dirt road. Dark, damaged, smelling of mold. But to them, it represented shelter. They stayed there for several days until one night when everything changed. He waited until she fell asleep. Then very quietly, he picked up a rusty wrench and brought it crashing down on her skull. She moved once, then stopped. He hit her again and again until her face was unrecognizable. He dragged her body across the room, removed her clothing, and began mutilating her corpse with terrifying calmness. He cut off her breasts and placed them over her eyes. He sliced deep into her torso, opening her body like a butcher cutting meat. Using black paint, he wrote "Death Room" on the wall above her. Then he simply walked away. Weeks later, a hiker smelled something terrible and pushed through the broken door. Police were stunned. No suspect, no motive, no fingerprint. Patrick had already moved north, blending in with other homeless populations. That's where he encountered Nadia Boccarino, 42, recently displaced and vulnerable. He played the same game. Fake sympathy, manufactured charm, promises of protection. She followed him trustingly. And just like before, it ended in horrific violence. He took Nadia to an open sandpit near an industrial site. He struck her in the head, dragged her into the dirt, and broke her spine in two. He tore into her abdomen, left her body exposed, then buried her in shallow sand, almost as if he wanted someone to discover her. And someone did. A cyclist noticed the wind had shifted the sand. A single breast was sticking out, sunburned, misshapen, grotesque. Police found the rest of her body, badly rotting, dismembered, face unrecognizable. Witnesses reported seeing Nadia with a strange man, tall, thin, with sharp cheekbones and dead eyes. Within days, they identified Patrick. He was arrested and charged with Ingrid's murder. At his trial, he sat perfectly still, barely blinking. When the prosecutor read the horrific details, he appeared completely bored. He received 26 years for Ingrid's murder, plus 2 years for hiding Nadia's corpse. In Porto Azzurro prison, guards kept him isolated. He rarely spoke. He drew strange diagrams constantly, distorted faces, twisted limbs. Eventually, officials gave him a cellmate, Alberto Colasma, a criminal who talked too much. It was a fatal mismatch. One morning in 2005, guards opened the cell door and froze. Blood splattered everywhere. Patrick sat cross-legged on the floor, hands covered in blood, smiling faintly. On the walls, painted in fresh blood, were crosses, mysterious numbers and symbols nobody could decipher. Patrick never explained. Later, he simply said Alberto talked too much. Another trial, another sentence, another psychiatric facility. Then, in 2007, he wrote a letter to the prosecutor confessing to all 3 murders: Ingrid, Nadia, and Alberto. He said he felt no regret, that each person was destined to die, that he had freed them from suffering. He called himself a tool sent to fix society's problems. Despite this confession, he couldn't be recharged for Nadia's murder. His existing sentence already covered that crime. Justice has its limits, and Patrick understood them perfectly. For the next 15 years, he disappeared from public view in a psychiatric institute. Isolated, silent, watching people with those same glassy, emotionless eyes. The disturbing drawings never stopped. Page after page of distorted human forms, bodies with missing limbs, gaping mouths, women without eyes. Then, on the night of March 25th, 2022, it all ended. At 3:17 a.m., night shift staff checked on him. He hadn't moved. They called his name, no response. When they touched his arm, it felt cold. Patrick Joseph Max Shaw died just as quietly as he had lived. He was 56 years old. He was buried in a municipal grave paid for by the city. No funeral, no priest, no gravestone, just an identification number and a hole in the ground. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed the content, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to support us even more, consider becoming a channel member. It means a lot. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.